So there is just an article that was published on the Substack on titled "What if we thought about the UCL issue in youth baseball more ecologically?" And I'll kind of scroll down. So essentially, we're writing about the UCL, and then, but as subscribers will see, like this is something that we've written about kind of extensively,
Yeah, yeah, we
right?
did that three-part series. Yep.
So you got, Absolute's view on it, and then there's a discussion on tissue senescence and how maybe that's why so many of these MLB pitchers are having it. Seems like a very like we haven't heard any argument against that.
Hmm.
And it seems like the longer this goes on, it seems like that's a very plausible argument. And then there's the UCL, the case where we essentially walk through the case of Spencer Strider, right? And and so obviously, like I think this is on your mind in a topic. And correct me if I'm wrong, just because your son is is playing at a high level in baseball, and
Yep. Yep, definitely. I think yes. I also the latest article that we wrote, I think, has a little bit of a different context to it because it focuses more on youth baseball, where our three-part series was, obviously on professional baseball. I think the unfortunate part of both of those scenarios is the high rate of UCL injury, both in professional baseball and in youth baseball. And you could argue that perhaps some of the factors in both of those populations that are, maybe part of the web of determinants for the injury are the same. But I also think that there's probably some different factors in youth athletes that are suffering from that injury and professional athletes that are suffering from that injury. So for those that maybe haven't read the three-part series, I think a large majority of our sort of framework for the injury was tissue senescence, basically saying that over the course of their careers, by the time they get to professional baseball, those those pitchers have such um, specific neural networks for pitching a baseball at high velocity, but their tissue function and tissue behaviors are older than what their chronological age would actually is. And that's just because of, the process of repetitive breakdown and buildup and repetitive breakdown and buildup in their tissues over time, most specifically in those cases, elbow tissues over time. And eventually that cycle ends and the tissue fails. I think our latest article, thinking about it a little bit more ecologically in youth athletes, and for those that maybe haven't read the article yet, it discusses and links to an article in CNN that I saw on social media from an orthopedic surgeon with the New York Yankees. And what really stood out was the high rate of UCL injuries in youth athletes at the middle school and high school levels, so now we're talking about, early teens, teenagers, um, suffering from these injuries and having to undergo reconstruction and repairs of this ligament. So again, from our point of view, thinking about this neurologically, kind of digging a little bit into the training of youth athletes, what what we mean by ecologically is that, in our view, once an athlete shows, particularly in baseball, although this does happen in other sports, my kids play other sports that at high levels that this happens in as well. Um, but what tends to happen in the development process of these youth athletes is those that show promise at an early age tend to become specialized earlier,
Hmm.
right? So, typical example would be, a middle school athlete, baseball player, let's say, pitcher throwing at high velocities. Coaches tend to then say, "Oh, well, this is great, and because of this, there's so much potential here," and so they tend to specialize that athlete specifically for pitching and all of the training that comes along with that. High intent throws, long um, portions of the year where they throw and they throw a lot. And what ends up happening is that starts to create that asymmetry that we talked about in that three-part series on Major League Baseball players,
Hmm.
where now you're really building the neural network in these athletes, which is great. And so what tends to happen in those youth athletes is because their nervous systems are so plastic and so moldable and are craving some of that specificity, that the more specific you get, the more output you're going to get, and it creates this positive feedback loop where, oh well, this youth athlete is showing even more promise, and so there's more potential, and they keep kind of going through that positive feedback loop. And what tends to
Hold on, hold
happen,
on, hold on, hold on. Let me stop you there.
yeah,
So that feedback loop that you're discussing is neurological in nature predominantly for skill acquisition.
yes.
Okay, so can you, in layman's terms, can you explain how that process leads to early tissue senescence for people that didn't read that article?
Yeah, I'll get there, I think. I think I'll get
Okay,
there. I think I'll get
okay,
there.
okay.
But thank you for keeping me on task here because I tend to ramble. But what I'm saying is that is I think what happens in those youth athletes, which then sometimes become professionals, but most specifically in the youth athletes, is we start to create that asymmetry where we're constantly stimulating the neural network, and of course the neural network is going to respond because they're youth athletes and their networks are very immature but craving that maturity. And so
Hmm.
new nodes are added, new connections are made. Obviously, outputs are going to scale accordingly, but we tend to then forget about the downside of that. And the downside that is the whole other ecology of which is biological in nature. And so, two things that I think are important there is we can't, on the youth side, we can't forget about the fact that most, and again, I don't want to make a blanket statement here, but most youth athletes don't train like youth athletes trained 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, right? Just there is that specialization now. There's so many other factors that they deal with now. Social media, phones. It's a big struggle that I have with my kids is getting them to get off of screens to just be kids again.
Hmm.
And so I think what ends up happening is you keep scaling one side of the system and you disregard the other side of the system. But what's happening underneath all of that is that process of kind of some biological breakdown, which in youth athletes and high school athletes is very subclinical. They don't, you know, they might not complain of soreness, they might not complain of tightness. Um, Sometimes they do, but what ends up happening is that's when you initiate that process of some breakdown, some regeneration, some breakdown, some regeneration, but we forget the general components of tissue behavior on that side, which then can become more specific tissue training as they age. And that's ultimately then when they get into older ages and we start to see that tissue senescence start to become a a larger factor.
So when you mean tissue senescence, make it even simpler. Like
So
you're
tissue
essentially,
senescence basically means that you have older tissues as a result of this repetitive cycle of breakdown as a result of stress, which is always occurring, and improper regeneration or
Mhm.
regeneration that's not guided appropriately. So then you have breakdown, regeneration. So what that means is that in a 25-year-old baseball pitcher, the tissues might be the equivalent of 40 years old.
Mhm. Mhm. And essentially part of